It's kind of weird to be talking to myself in my bathroom, but let's get into it. So, welcome to the first vlog of the SIBO Diaries. For kind of my first topic that is kind of near and dear to my heart and something that I think a lot of people have a ton of confusion over, and myself included in this, before I kind of started to dig through my own research. And even then, it's still not clear cut, but I can kind of go through some of the findings that I found in particular on this topic. And so what I want to talk about today is probiotics. It's such a heavily contested contested debate in the SIBO community on whether they're helpful or harmful, or when to take them, when to not take them, and it can be really kind of confusing. And I think a lot of people get really freaked out to try probiotics when they could be helpful, or maybe people take probiotics when they're not ready. So today, kind of what I want to do is really just go through what kind of the research says about probiotics and whether they're safe to try, and then kind of go through what the arguments are, and then kind of go through my position on probiotics just based on my own experience, and then also on some of the research that I've done myself. And then kind of lastly, I want to go through what kind of things you should consider when you're trying probiotics, and what kind of things that can be super helpful. So let's get into it. So when we talk about kind of the argument that's going around in the SIBO community, there's a camp that is very kind of anti-probiotic. Some practitioners really don't like probiotics because they kind of feel like you already have bacteria in your small intestine. If you're eating probiotics, either with fermented foods or with a supplement, they kind of feel like you're fueling that fire. You know, you're just adding more bacteria that's going to sit in there and cause more fermentation. And then you kind of have another camp that says, well, you need probiotics. They're essential for gut health. They'll help with any dysbiosis that is going on in the large intestine. And I think there are points that are correct from both sides, and I think it's helpful to just kind of go through kind of the key mechanisms that are involved in the arguments, and kind of what the research says, and how maybe probiotics can fit into a treatment, like a proper treatment plan. So I want to kind of describe the mechanism that the big practitioners and the key researchers are kind of attributing to chronic SIBO cases. And that is something called the Migrating Motor Cortex, which is a mouthful. I'm just gonna probably refer to it as the MMC for the rest of this because it's just easier. But essentially what the MMC is this nervous stimulation in the GI tract that causes a wave-like kind of stimulation that really moves food through the small intestine into the large intestine. So it's kind of, I really like the description of it being like this broom that kind of goes in and sweeps the debris, like food debris and bacteria from the GI, from the small intestine into the large intestine, and really keeps things moving properly and not allowing things to sit in the small intestine for a very long period of time where it can ferment and cause SIBO symptoms. So kind of the bigger researchers like Pimentel, Seebecker, and even Datis Karazian has talked about this. But that SIBO is really kind of, when you have chronic SIBO, a breakdown in that kind of wave-like action is really going to prevent healing. So that's kind of at the root of really getting past chronic SIBO, and kind of, if you take an antibiotic and you might have relief for 2 weeks, but then everything comes back, that's probably a breakdown in your migrating motor cortex. So now that we've kind of understood, or I guess I've highlighted that a little bit. So in someone with SIBO, they're going to have a lot less frequent MMC action between meals compared to a healthy person. So a healthy person, between their meals, they're going to have like 12 sweeps of their small intestine throughout the day. So when they're not eating, their nervous system is stimulating this action that's sweeping the small intestine clean and really detoxifying their GI tract and pushing everything along and keeping everything moving. Awesome. So in someone with SIBO, that action does not happen nearly as frequently. So it's only going to happen it's only going to happen like 6 times in a day instead of like 12, for example. So it's going to be greatly reduced. It's not sweeping as frequently, so bacteria and things sit in there and ferment and so on. So now that I've kind of gone over a little basics on the MMC, this kind of is gonna help me explain probiotics because they have some action in the MMC. So now that I've kind of established that the MMC is really crucial in dealing with SIBO, I kind of want to explain that there's kind of in my mind, there's like 2 mechanisms that can really cause that breakdown. So the first is the brain is sending a signal through the vagus to the nervous system in the gut to stimulate that action, to stimulate the MMC. So there can be a breakdown in the vagus stimulation. So the strength of your vagal tone and the strength of the response from the brain to the vagus to the GI tract can be really kind of disturbed and broken, and that can really cause an issue with ever overcoming SIBO. But I think an area that doesn't get talked about is the second mechanism that can cause a breakdown. And that is really the role of the environment, and specifically the gut microbes' role in communicating to the nervous system to stimulate the migrating motor cortex. So the bacteria in the gut play a crucial role in communicating to the nervous system and back to the brain. It's not really a linear relationship between the brain and the gut, but the gut microbes actually communicate back to the brain to stimulate this response. And I just think that part of the breakdown isn't discussed as much. You kind of see a lot of people talking about vagal nerve exercises, but you don't hear as much of a discussion being talked about the role of having a healthy bacterial base in the large intestine to stimulate a healthy functioning small intestine. So I guess like the really important point is that if there isn't balance in your gut microbes, so if you don't have good bacteria in your gut, that your migrating motor cortex is never going to heal. So there have been like really interesting studies in rats on the role of the large intestine bacteria and the stimulation of the migrating motor cortex. So these scientists, what they did was they bred germ-free rats, so rats without any microbiome essentially, and they tested their migrating motor cortex to see how it was running. So they did an initial test, and then they also did another test after they re-inoculated those mice with bacteria from healthy rats. So the before test showed that the migrating motor cortex was disturbed, so was not functioning properly, that there's basically the microbes in their large intestine were not creating that strong migrating motor cortex in the small intestine. But the interesting thing was after they inoculated those rats with healthy bacteria in their large intestine, it basically fixed the function of their small intestine. So they basically increased the strength and number of waves in their migrating motor cortex. So the researchers also did a follow-up study where they wanted to see if the types of bacteria made a difference in the migrating motor cortex in these rats. So they each inoculated these rats with particular strains of bacteria. So what they found was the rats that got an injection of Lactobacillus acidophilus and Bifidobacterium bifidum, which are both like two really, I want to say the good, what we typically think of as the good bacteria. So when these rats were given good bacteria, they had a strong migrating motor cortex, so a strong stimulation in their small intestine. But the interesting thing is when the researchers gave the rats, I'm just going to call them more shady types of bacteria, so like E. coli, for example, the rats that they gave large strains of E. coli to had a disturbed migrating motor cortex, so it wasn't functioning properly and was delayed and causing delayed small intestine transit. So, I mean, the moral of the story is really that you can't totally repair your small intestine function without addressing dysbiosis in the large intestine or without establishing good bacteria in your large intestine, because you need a functioning migrating motor cortex in your small intestine to really kind of get over really chronic SIBO case or like a really chronic SIBO situation. So everyone's probably wondering, why did she go on this long-winded talk about the migrating motor cortex and stimulation, all this stuff? But I think it's really essential to understand probiotics' role in all this. So what do we need to fix dysbiosis in the large intestine? I would argue that probiotics are essential at some point, and the key word is at some point in your treatment, to really fix dysbiosis that's going on in the large intestine. and really so that migrating motor cortex can be repaired and be as strong as possible. The action of probiotics are more than just creating this stronger migrating motor cortex and the stronger small intestine function, but they also help modulate your immune system. They help repair leaky gut. They also create really optimal pH in the GI tract so that good bacteria can grow and bad bacteria can die, which is always good. And they actually can attack SIBO head on by creating antimicrobial compounds in the GI tract. So certain strains have been shown to actually attack SIBO head on because they're essentially sort of like antibiotics, nature's own antibiotics, or more natural forms. All right, so to sum up, probiotics are essential for repairing the migrating motor cortex and sustaining it, and they're also just essential for gut health in general. So on to what you need to consider when you're dealing with SIBO treatment and probiotics. So I think probiotics scare people with SIBO because I think we get so focused on killing, like any type of bacteria we just need to kill. You know, I think we get stuck in that attitude, and it can kind of prevent healing or trying other things like probiotics when they could really help you. And not to say that people will always have good reactions to probiotics, but you know, you can always try it and then stop. You know, a lot of actually, this might be a good time to discuss the research. So there hasn't been a ton of research on probiotics and SIBO directly, but the 6 or 7 studies that I looked at show probiotics in a pretty positive light. I think some of them have been shown to be effective just on their own, and then there's also been a couple studies that have shown them in conjunction with antibiotics, and they're pretty much shown in a positive light. I actually wrote a write-up about all that stuff, or about those I actually wrote a write-up about the research that I looked into, and I posted it so that you can look at it yourselves. But I think the big takeaway is that no one's having life-threatening issues when they're taking probiotics. It's pretty safe to just try. But then again, I want to go through kind of the things that you should consider when you're thinking about taking a probiotic. So first and foremost is, I think most people do better after the bacterial load is way down. So probiotics probably, and maybe I'm wrong, but maybe I kind of think that they'd be better after some sort of antimicrobial or antibiotic that you're taking for treatment. So once you kind of get that bacterial load down a little bit, you'll be able to tolerate probiotics probably a lot better. I know I did. But I think timing is really the biggest thing that you need to consider, because I do think there's some people that have such a high bacterial load that probiotics will aggravate their system and they need to tolerate probiotics right away. So once the bacterial load gets down, they'll be you'll probably be much more likely to tolerate them. Another thing too is if you feel like you've gotten rid of SIBO or gotten your bacterial load and you still can't tolerate probiotics, you just feel really bloated when you take them. Also it could be a timing issue because there could also be breakdowns going on between your brain vagus to gut connection. So really focusing on rebuilding and strengthening that connection. So you can do that by like gargling, humming. I know some people do like gagging, or I think even like coffee enemas. I know if you want to look into some of those, I know Datis Karazian really talks about a lot of that stuff. But really kind of getting the brain to gut connection better, and then trying probiotics again could be a good option. So that's something to consider when you're looking into timing. Particular strains can be important. So I know, like, based on some Facebook groups and even some of the stuff that some practitioners have said, it seems that some people really struggle with lacto strains of bacteria. So like Lactobacillus acidophilus and other kind of lacto-based strains, people can have issues with. I think it has something to do with like just a sensitivity to that strain. So that's something to consider. So if you've tried a supplement or maybe even eaten fermented foods and not tolerated it super well, it could have something to do with the particular strains. And then also just like how you're getting it, so the form. So some people like really tolerate fermented foods really well but don't tolerate supplements as well. But some people cannot tolerate fermented foods, and that could be a histamine issue. So if you have histamine issues, I would definitely steer clear of, your sauerkrauts, your kefir, and your like other fermented foods. Probably best to avoid them, and maybe supplement would be better. As far as particular brands of supplements or anything like that, I think spore-based supplements, in my opinion, seem to work really well for me. And I know some of the bigger practitioners like Chris Kresser and others recommend spore forms. They seem to survive the GI tract a lot better. So some of the brands I'm thinking of are Prescripticist and Megaspore. And actually, I've taken Megaspore for a while now, and it blows my mind that it's an amazing probiotic, in my opinion. It survives the gastric pH, so a lot of probiotics don't survive the stomach, and so they really can't be effective in the large intestine if they're not surviving the stomach. But Megaspore is one of the ones that really survives the transit and really can do a lot of great things in the belly. But so one of the cool things too about Megaspore is there's some strains in there that are particularly that have been studied to be effective against SIBO. So that's really cool. I think most of the strains, I think all of the strains are actually bacillus based. And I've heard people call them the Marines of like probiotics, because they're just really, they have a really high survivability and stuff like that. But so Megaspore is awesome. If you haven't tried a probiotic or you're unsure, I would definitely look into that one. Because it's great. But there's also been a lot of people on the SIBO Facebook group that have talked about Megaspore, so I'd highly recommend looking into or searching like Megaspore or something and looking at what other people are saying about it, not just me. I think another thing to remember too is to go really low and slow to begin with, because I've had this issue too where I've been like really gung-ho to try probiotics again and have taken too high of a dose, and that never ends well. But so just consider like taking a much smaller dose, even that's on what the bottle says, and just building your way up from there and not trying to push it any more than you need to. I think that's really like all I have, even though I just spoke for a very long period of time. But I think to sum up I want to say that personally, I feel that probiotics are essential at fixing large intestine issues that are affecting small intestine function. And I think the anti-probiotic camp is right in saying that some people can't tolerate probiotics at certain points of treatment, so when their bacterial load is high. But I think to never try probiotics is a mistake. But that's just my opinion and based on what I've researched. So I would love to hear other people's opinions on probiotics and what kind of successes or even failures with particular methods or strains or anything like that. Would be awesome to get your all's feedback. But until next time, I guess it would be awesome too if you guys had any particular topics or questions that like maybe I have researched or that you would like me to research. That would be awesome too, because I'd like it to remain relevant to people within the SIBO community and stuff like that. So until next time, this was real. See you later. Bye.